starting on your DM crafting journey with a simple and versatile project, dungeon tiles are probably a great starting point. Whether making them from cardboard, foam or other materials, they are easily one of the best beginner projects. Not that I know from experience, as I decided on making a small farmhouse as my first project when getting into the hobby. So here I am, the DM without the dungeon, something I really wanted to rectify. Now, as I didn't want to go the usual route of making dungeon tiles, I decided to try another approach. With this, I imagined a single surface, like these 1 foot by 1 foot tiles by TT Combat. Underneath its texture, a metallic sheet to adhere terrain pieces, with slim footprints via magnets. Slim footprints like wall pieces would have. I built a 1 square foot tile like instructed. It's pretty easy, to be honest. For the magnetic properties of the surface, I used the same galvanized steel sheets I used on my DM screen project from my last video. Magnetic strength decreases a lot when there is even a small gap, like a couple of millimeters, between a magnet and a ferromagnetic surface. And as I planned to put a bit of texture on my tile, I needed to be sure that the underlying sheet is strong enough to assure a good bond. These sheets were pre-cut to a 30 by 30 cm size, which is only slightly smaller than the 1 foot side length of the tiles. I glued one of the sheets to the tile with construction adhesive, just to make sure they really stick together. Following that, I covered the complete tile with a black paint and PVA mix. I didn't want to glue my texture directly onto the steel, and I figured a simple coat of this mixture would help a lot with adhesion. For the stone texture, I wanted to use the same technique I used when I built my tavern a few months back. Cork bricks. In my opinion, cork is a great alternative to foam bricks, especially if you don't own a hot wire cutter. I wanted to have an even surface, so there wouldn't be problems with the wall pieces later, so I decided to only use 2 mm thick sheets for my bricks. They are thick enough to give a bit of texture, but also are slim enough to guarantee a proper magnetic bond. But if you want to have a more interesting surface, you could use multiple thicknesses to get more variety in the tile work. I cut my bricks in varying sizes, 5 by 10 mm and 10 by 15 mm. First, I glued rows of bigger bricks on the tile, leaving a gap of about 15 mm. This way I have a distance of about 25 mm between each corresponding sides, which roughly translates to an inch. So you see, although I don't use a traditional grid on these pieces, as I usually don't play with one, I still have a hint of a grid and somewhat of a secret way of quickly measuring distances if needed. Next, I filled in each resulting space with 2 rows of the smaller bricks. Overall, I tried to leave big enough gaps between the bricks for the following step that would fill in those gaps. First, I roughed up the surface with a wire brush. The idea is to give it a more worn and natural look. It also is a good test to see if the bond between the metallic sheet and the bricks is strong enough. Still, here and there a cork piece will be ripped off completely. This is, however, not a bad thing. On the contrary, the missing brick, or in this case tile, totally adds to the worn look. As the last step before painting, I mix a bit of tile grout with PVA and black paint. I applied this grey mixture to the complete surface, making sure it went into all the gaps between the cork. Before it could set, I removed the excess on top of the tiles, trying to keep the filler between the tiles intact. After that, I let the filler mix dry and moved to the next big thing on my agenda, the dungeon walls. In my last video I already mentioned this, but the earlier Diablo games belong to my all-time favorites. And although I played mostly the second game, the first Diablo has a very distinct atmosphere and look. The first step into its dungeon are frightening and harrowing, but still motivating. So the design of this dungeon set is heavily inspired by the first levels of this game. And this will become most obvious when you look at the wall pieces. Early on, I knew I wanted each piece to have a pillar on one side. Also, I wanted the walls to be usable from both sides, so I could build rooms with intersecting walls. With that in mind, I started to build a few test pieces to figure out an appropriate height and length. In the end, I decided to go with a height of about 3 centimeters and the length of about 7.5, which roughly translates to 3 inches. With that, I started to construct the basic structure for the wall. I used these wooden strips I still had laying around from my Game Master Screens project, which had the perfect measurements with a thickness of 0.5 centimeters and a width of 3 centimeters. With my handsaw and a new guide for even cuts, I started to cut the complete strip into 6 centimeter long parts, which resulted in exactly 40 individual wood pieces. I figured more is, well, more on this part, at least when I decide to build more ground tiles. For the pillars, I used these Nerf gun darts, which in a stroke of luck I never threw away. They have the perfect diameter and when painted have a nice subtle texture. From a thicker corked sheet, 5mm to be exact, I cut a small plinth for the pillar and glued both pieces together with PVA. The grider pillars were then glued to one of the short sides of the wooden cuts. Now for texturing the pieces, I again went with cork bricks. Here I almost exclusively used the 5x10mm bricks for the wall. One exception were the bricks on the lowest row. Here I deliberately made 2 of them about 25mm long to again have this subtle hint of a grid. So I coated the side I wanted to texture with a PVA and black paint mix and added the bricks. After repeating that 39 times, I started again at the beginning and textured the other side of the wall, which I also repeated 39 times. I also covered these holes of the Nerf darts with air drying clay. After letting this dry for about a day, I gave the walls the wire brush treatment and covered them, just like the ground tiles, with a grout mix, excluding the pillars. Again, I removed the excess and let the pieces dry. Now, every dungeon would be useless if you couldn't enter it. Therefore, I needed a few doors and maybe some stairs to indicate the staging area for the dungeon. The stairs were pretty easily made. I took one of the woodcuts to have a wall to adhere my steps to. Again, I tried to capture the look of Diablo with this, so I wanted a circular shaped stairway like the one in the game. For this, I first used cardstock and cut out a half circle for the base shape. I also cut out an identical sized shape out of my 5mm thick cork sheet, repeating this 3 times while always decreasing the radius by 5mm. These half circles were then cut in multiple pieces. This way the stairway would look like it's made out of multiple bricks. Before gluing them in place, however, I sanded the edges of each individual cork piece to give them an even more natural look. After that, I glued everything in place and adhered the stairs to the wall. The following steps were then just a repeat of what I did with the walls. With the stairs drying, I started to work on the doors. Here I quickly thought about the dungeon tiles by Wylock's Armory. His dungeon walls are built with a clip-on feature in mind. That means that you can put your doors, wall decorations and other things of interest anywhere you want and don't need dedicated wall pieces for any of these things. Of course, I linked his channel down below if you're curious. If you don't know it, please check it out. Again, I made a test piece to get an idea for the distance between the door fronts. In the end, 1 centimeter seemed to be the perfect distance. It is wide enough to slide the door piece onto the wall easily, but close enough to have a bit of resistance, so it doesn't wobble around uncontrollably. Now, when looking at the doors in the game, I noticed one key difference to my test piece. Doors in the Diablo dungeon have a rounded top, which is a bit more challenging. So first I made some door shapes out of craft paper with a bit of overhang on the sides. These would serve as a backdrop to glue all my door pieces on. Then I started with coffee stir sticks that simply have the perfect scale for wooden boards. After the glue was completely dry, I cut off the excess stir sticks, following the shape of the paper backdrop. Now I could glue them on 1 cm thick EPS blocks. I only glued the upper area to the sheets, leaving a 3 cm high gap. This gap would later be the area which would slide onto the wall piece. I waited for the PVA to set, cut the EPS at the edge of the door and glued a second door front to the other side of the EPS. Following that, I added small cork bricks to the overhang, as these would serve as the lower part of the door frame. Again, I let the PVA set and started to cut out a few door bricks for the upper door frame. These were roughly 1 cm long with a 5 by 5 mm profile. I covered the visible EPS on top with these bricks and let the complete piece dry thoroughly. Now, before I added the grout mix, I went over the bricks with sandpaper and added vertical wood boards to the doors. With that, I added the tile grout to the bricks, removed the excess and let them dry with all the other pieces. Now I could start painting, which I started with a simple black paint and PVA mix as a base coat. I wanted to make sure that all the grout would stay in place, and I figured another coat of glue would help with that. As a next step, I applied indigo and burnt umber, which I previously watered down to an almost wash-like consistency. At that point, I used different approaches for the floor tile and the rest of the set. I wanted to replicate the color scheme of this particular dungeon, which features reddish floor tiles and bluish wall pieces. Starting with the floor tile, I first dry brushed terracotta and then yellow ochre. Then I mixed red paint with pebble gray and carefully dry brushed this mix onto the floor. As a last step, I applied a bit of red ink as a filter over the complete tile to push the paint job more towards a red hue. For the wall pieces, I went with a dry brush of neutral gray, followed by a dry brush of a primary cyan for the bricks. This cyan is transparent, so it works more like a filter than like a true dry brush. The bricks were then highlighted with a dry brush with a sandy off-white. I repainted the pillars with a neutral gray and dry brushed them with pebble gray. For the doors, I used my usual approach of old rotten wood. With the black base coat and the indigo and burnt umber wash applied, I first dry brushed the wood with the same sand tone I used on the bricks and applied raw umber and sap green ink. After that, I went over the door with a very carefully applied dry brush with a sand tone. Now all the set needed were the magnets. Adding these was pretty easy thanks to my rotary tool. I carved out appropriate holes on the underside of the pillars and adhered magnets with a drop of PVA. And after all that was dry, the first part of my dungeon set was ready to entertain, or maybe horrify, a new band of adventurers. Finally, I have my own dungeon set. I really look forward to using it in our next adventures. Also, I really want to expand on this, adding a bit of scattered terrain and maybe add a few alternative wall pieces as well. If you don't want to miss that, please consider subscribing. Also, if you want to support my work here, you can simply do so with a like or a comment. It really means a lot to me. Thank you for watching, and if you like this one, you may also like this one where I built a huge mountain with a mystical gate on top. I hope to see you in the next one, and until then, farewell, fellow adventurers.